Okay. We're going to, Mirza Hashem, talk about the mitzvah of tshuva on Yom HaKippurim and the power of tshuva on Yom HaKippurim and what is the koyach of Yom HaKippurim. We're going to begin with the Gemara in Yuma and Daf Pei Vav, where the Gemara talks about that there's 4 different levels of tshuva. And it depends on the chet that you do. There's arba chiluki kapora. If a person is over a mitzvah saseh, so the Gemara tells us if he does tshuva, he gets a kapora with tshuva alone. If he's over something which is more chomer, like a loy saseh, so then tshuva itself doesn't work, the Gemara says, but he needs also Yom HaKippurim. Tshuva toile v'yom HaKippurim mechaper, and that's what it means when it says ki b'yom hazeh yechaper aleichem, that Yom Kippur will be mechaper on those chatoim like the loitza says. And then the Brisa continues and says, what happens if he's over something that's more chomer, like krisis umisis pesdin? There it says it doesn't even work together with Yom Kippur. Tshuva and Yom Kippur have a power of to be toile mina yisurim, but the kapora doesn't come unless he gets yisurim. So yisurim are memarkin. And then the 4th thing mentioned is even what's more chomer than that is if Rachmana litzlan you're mechalel Hashem. Somebody who has an oven of chilul Hashem. So the Gemara tells us tshuva, Yom Kippur, Yisurim, all of them together also don't tuah for kapora, nor you need misa, kulan toilin, umisa mimarekas. Now we're going to discuss a few problems in this Yisoid, what the Gemara tells us, that there's certain chatoyim that Yom Kippur doesn't work for them, and you need we said, for example, like krisis umisis bezdin, you need also yisurim. Or if you discuss chilul Hashem, it doesn't even work with yisurim. Now we're going to first go to the tefillas of Yom HaKippurim. You know, every tefillah in Yom HaKippurim, we end it off with a tefillah, and we say to the Rebbeinu Shalom, Mashe chotosi lefonecha. Whatever I sinned, mechoik b'rachamecha HaRabim, I'm asking you, Rebbeinu Shalom, to please forgive me with your rachamecha HaRabim, avoloi ayidei yisurim v'chaloyim roim. But I ask you, I should not get yisurim, and I should not get chaloyim roim. Now this seems to be shver from the Gemara, because the Gemara tells us there's a certain chatoyim that you can't get a kapor just with Yom HaKippurim, and krisis umisis bezin requires yisurim, and especially also chilul Hashem needs even more. So what does it mean? We come to daven to the Rebbeinu Shalom, we say to him, Morek b'rachmecha HaRabim, without yisurim and chaloyim roim. You know, in the Nusach al Chet, we just bring out so many different averas that we are over, and we also talk about chatoyim shanu chayovim aleim chorus, val chatoyim shanu chayovim aleim misas bezdin, and we beg the Rebbeinu Shalom to give us a mechila and a kapora today on Yom Kippur for those chatoyim of chorus and misas bezdin, when the Gemara in fact tells us that we can't get a kapora for those chatoyim unless we have also yisurim. So what does it mean? We come and ask the Rebbeinu Shalom that we should get a kapora al kulam, kaper lanu, slach lanu, including even chatoyim of misas bezdin and chayvi krisis. We also mention in the nusach of the al chet, in the chatoyim that we bring out, we talk about a chet of chilul Hashem as well. And we say, al chet shechatonu lefanecha b'chilul Hashem, and we ask the Rebbeinu Shalom, he should be moichel us for the chet of chilul Hashem. How do we understand that? If on chilul Hashem, the Gemara tells us Yom Kippur doesn't help to make a kapora, even with yisurim, and unless Rachmana litzlan until you die, you don't get a kapora for chilul Hashem. And nevertheless, when it comes Yom Kippur, we talk about Chet of Chilul Hashem as well. You know, in the Nusach HaTvil of Yom HaKippurim, we say something strange. We say, Vatitin lanu es Yom HaKippurim hazeh lemechila leslicha lekapor. We mention and bring out the Yom Kippur is a day that we can be zoichet to mechila, slicha, ukapora. And then we continue and we say, Ulimchol boy as kol avoyneseinu, the Rebbeinu Shalom should be moichelas on all our chatoyim. Now the Chayre, first of all, what does it mean, Limchol boy as kol avoyneseinu, when we know that Yom Kippur doesn't work on all our avoynes. Yom Kippur doesn't work for Chet of Chilul Hashem. Yom Kippur doesn't work for Krisis Umisis Bezdin. So what is the meaning when we say Limchol boy as kol chatoiseinu? And second of all, why do we repeat? We begin saying Vatitin lanu es Yom HaKippurim hazeh lemechila leslicha lekapora, and then we add something that it doesn't fit in, and then we say again Limchol boy. We should narrowly say Vatitin lanu es Yom HaKippurim lemechila leslicha lekapora for all our avoinus. What is the meaning that we break this tefillah down to two parts? We first say that Rebbeinu Shalom, you gave us this for a day of mechila slicha kapora, and then we continue and say ulimchol, and also limchol boy es kol avoinuseinu. The Shari Tשובת to Rabbeinu Yoine in Shar Dalit Oish Yud Zayin, he questions something, and he says, Chazal tell us that on Krisis and Mises Bezdin, Tshuva Toile and Yom Kippur is Toile, and only Yisurim are remarking. And he says, how does this fit in with the Pasuk? The Pasuk says, when it talks about Yom Kippur, it says, Mikol chatoiseichem lifnei Hashem titoru. It seems, he says from the Pasuk, that Yom Kippur has a power for all chatoim, even for chatoim of chayvi krisis or mises bezdin. You can get to a tahara and a kapora on Yom Kippur from all chatoim, and nevertheless, the Gemara tells us differently. The Gemara tells us that even though you go through a Yom Kippur, nevertheless, for krisis or mises bezdin, it doesn't work without Yisurim. And Rabbeinu Yoina says that the pasuk that says that Mikol Chatiseichem Lifnei Hashem Titoru doesn't really mean that Yom Kippur can be mechaper on all our chatoim. Yom Kippur, he says, cannot really be mechaper on all our chatoim, because the Gemara tells us it only works for loisa says. That's what it means. Ki bayoyim hazeh yichaper aleichem. What the pasuk means, Mikol Chatiseichem Lifnei Hashem Titoru, is telling us a besondere mitzvah of tshuva when it comes to Yom Kippur. And he explains, and he says, even though we have an ongoing mitzvah to do tshuva constantly, we always have a mitzvah of tshuva. Every day of the year we have a birchas tshuva and we have a mitzvah of tshuva. But when it comes to Yom Kippur, there's an added mitzvah of tahara, Mikol Chatiseichem Lifnei Hashem Titoru, and Rabbeinu Yoina says that's an extra mitzvah on Yom Kippur, and there are differences between the mitzvah of Kol Hashon and Yom Kippur, and that's not the topic that we're going into, but this is the yesod that Rabbeinu Yoina explains, that the pasuk Mikol Chatiseichem Lifnei Hashem Titoru doesn't mean, Zakt Rabbeinu Yoina, that you could get a kapora for all your chatoim. You cannot get, Zakt Rabbeinu Yoina, kapora for all your chatoim on Yom Kippur, because on those chamuris you don't get a kapora unless you have later Yisurim, or for Chilul Hashem, like we mentioned, you need even Misa. The pasuk is merely bringing out there's a mitzvah, but if you to make tshuva on everything on Yom Kippur, but you don't get your kapora on the other things, there you get a kapora on Yom Kippur. So Rabbeinu Yoina tells us clearly that Yom Kippur does not work on all the chatoim, and even though it says Mikol Chatiseichem Lifnei Hashem Titoru, it doesn't really mean that Yom Kippur will give us a kapora for all of our chatoim. Rather, it's telling me there's a besondere mitzvah, there's a separate mitzvah to do tshuva on Yom HaKippurim. Now, if you go through the Rambam in Hilchos Tshuva, the Rambam never brings out such a zach, something like that. There's a separate mitzvah to do tshuva on Yom Kippur. The Rambam merely says that Yom Kippur is a zman to do tshuva, vuketz mechilu slicha liyisrael. But the Lashon Rambam is meduyik that the Rambam does not agree with Rabbeinu Yoina. And the Rambam doesn't hold that there is a besondere mitzvah to do tshuva on Yom HaKippurim. And if that is the case, so the kasha of Rabbeinu Yoina falls back on the Rambam. The Pasuk says, Mikol chatiseichem lifnei Hashem titoru. And if you don't learn it's a separate mitzvah, that's not what the Pasuk is saying. It's obvious the Pasuk saying you can get a tahara from all your chatoim on Yom HaKippurim. How do we understand that? The Gemara says clearly you cannot get a kapora for all your chatoim. Now we're going to end for this. I'll be a big chiddush that we find in the Miri in the Masechta Yuma. And there's two Miris that we are going to go through and discuss. There's a Miri in Yuma Daf Pevov and a Miri on the Mishnah of Yuma Daf Pehei Omid Beis. We're first going to begin with the Miri on Daf Pevov, where the Braisa differentiates with the different sugei chatoim, that some chatoim need more. Some chatoim don't help just tshuva, but you need more. An essay, tshuva alone. A lav needs Yom Kippur besides tshuva. When it comes to krisis umisas bezdin, it doesn't even help you. You have to have yisurim also. And then we have what's called chilul Hashem, that you need misa to be mechaper. Now first the Miri tells us a chiddush, and he says the level of tshuva and the type of tshuva you're supposed to do depends on the chomer of the chet. If it's a shvacher chet, like an essay, you don't have to do such a great tshuva as you have to do as a lav. As the chomer oven gets bigger, your tshuva is supposed to be intensified, and it's to be a stronger and a greater sort tshuva. And the same, all these chatoim that the Gemara brings out, that there's different levels of chet, each level has in it a besondere level of tshuva that pertains to that specific chet. And then he comes on and he says a big chiddush, and he says as follows: but if you will do what he calls a tshuva gemura, that always will work. Anytime a person will do a tshuva gemura, le'olam ein hapar gudnino mipnei hatshuva hagemura. That means the Miri is telling us this yisoid and this chiddush, that even though the Gemara tells us that Tshuvas needs more when it comes to certain chatoim, but that's dependent on what type of a tshuva you're doing. If you can get to a complete tshuva, if you can get what we call a tshuva hagmura, then it could work tshuva alone. You don't need anything more for the tshuva. Anytime a person is bekoyach to do a tshuva gemura, it's going to work even though you do it without Yisurim, without Yom Kippur, without Misa. Tshuva gemura has a power to be mechaper on every single chet. This is one chiddush that the Miri says in Yuma Daf Pevov when he talks about the Braisa. Now there's a Mishnah on Yuma Pehei Omid Beis that seems to contradict the Braisa. The Mishnah in Yuma Daf Pehei Omid Beis talks about chamuris. And the Mishnah says that what happens when you have a chet that's chomer, like krisis umisas bezdin. Zok the Mishnah, tshuva toile v'yom kippur mechaper. The Mishnah says that if you do a chomer dikechet, and it comes Yom Kippur itself is going to give you the kapora. You don't need anything more besides Yom Kippur, even for chamuris. It says that when it goes by Yom Kippur, it's mechaper on chamuris ad sheyova Yom Kippur v'yichaper. Now the Miri gives us an insight into this Mishnah, what the Mishnah means, that if it comes Yom Kippur, even for Chamuris, that it's going to work with Yom Kippur alone. And he explains and he says, when a Yid comes to Yom Kippur, he becomes inspired, he becomes elevated, and min hastam, when a person comes to Yom Kippur, he gets to the level of Tshuva Gemurah. And being that he gets to the level of Tshuva Gemurah on Yom Kippur, it's going to work without anything more. And he says, really, it can work even throughout the year. If you can get to Tshuva Gemurah throughout the year, it's going to work, because Tshuva Gemurah can always work. But generally speaking, you won't reach that level of Tshuva Gemurah that should work by itself for Chamuris or Chilul Hashem. But when you get to Yom Kippur, you get such a Isairis that you get to the level of a Tshuva Gemurah, and because you get to that level of Tshuva Gemurah, it does not require anything more. Now, l'choire, we have ourselves a stira from the Bryce and the Mishnah. The Mishnah seems to tell us that Tshuva and Yom Kippur can work even on the Chamuris, and the way the Miri explains it, because when we come to Yom Kippur, you get to the highest level of Tshuva, and you get to a Tshuva Gemurah, and when a person gets to Tshuva Gemurah, it's mechaper for everything. On the other hand, the Brisa tells me that even if you have Yom Kippur, when it's coming for Chamuris, it's not enough. You need Yisurim. And I believe what the Miri means, and this is going to open up the sugya and give us a key, that there's two dinim in Yom Kippur. If you look at carefully at the Loshen of the Miri on Daf Pei Amud Beis, he says min hastam, when it comes to Yom Kippur, a person gets to the point that he makes a tshuva gemurah. That means that normally a person is bekoyach, and we say that a person going through the avodas hayoim of Yom HaKippurim will get to such a high level that he'll get to do a tshuva gemurah. And if he does that, there's a koyach of tshuva gemurah, and it's not really totally bedafka with Yom Kippur, because if you did a tshuva gemurah in any day of the year, it would work. But usually what happens is you don't get to that level, only on Yom Kippur. But then there's a second din in Yom Kippur, and that's the power and the koyach of Yom Kippur, even if you don't do a tshuva gemurah. There's a koyach in itzumah shel yom. The koyach of the day of Yom Kippur is that Yom Kippur brings forth a kapor. You know, there's a machloikas in the Gemara. One mandomer holds that Yom Kippur is mechaper even if you don't do tshuva, because it's a koyach of itzumah shel yom, ki bayoyim hazeh yichaper aleichem. There's a koyach in the day, that this day has a koyach to cleanse and purify and clean and be mechaper. So there's a mandomer that says that there's a koyach without tshuva. Now, even if we disagree on that mandomer, and we hold that Yom Kippur cannot be mechaper if you don't do tshuva, but it doesn't mean you have to do a tshuva gemurah to get the power of Yom Kippur. For the koyach of Yom Kippur to be mechaper, Yom Kippur has a koyach to be mechaper even if you don't do a tshuva gemurah. The Miri is telling us there's a second koyach in Yom Kippur, and that is b'mikra, where you get to the level of a tshuva gemurah. Then there's a separate inyan that because you got to that tshuva gemurah, therefore you're going to have the koyach of that kapora that's emanating and coming from the tshuva gemurah. Now, lefizeh, what we can understand is as follows. The Mishnah and the Brisa are talking about two different things and two different aspects of Yom Kippur. The Mishnah tells me ala chamuris, tshuva, toile, v'Yom Kippur mechaper. And the Mishnah is telling me Yom Kippur alone can work when it comes to chamuris. Avdem kumt the Miri in Pei Amud Beis and says, you should know that a person is bekoyach to get to a tshuva gemurah on Yom Kippur more than any other day of the year, and being that you can get, and that's the skulas hayoim, and if you can get to that kapor, that tshuva gemurah, then it could be mechaper on you without isurim, without anything, without misa. It doesn't make a difference. Then there's a koyak in the fact that you did a complete tshuva. The Brisa of Dalet Chiluki Kapore is talking about a different aspect of Yom Kippur. That even if you don't get to the complete tshuva on your Yom Kippur, nevertheless Yom Kippur has a power in it. It has a power, Itzum Yoim is mechaper with tshuva. Now when we talk about Yom Kippur is mechaper with tshuva, it doesn't have to be a tshuva gemur. Even if it's not a tshuva gemur, Afal Pikin Yom Kippur has a power to be mechaper. Now when we're not talking about a complete tshuva, that's where the Brisa differentiates and says there's 4 chiluki kapore. If you didn't do a tshuva gemura, so it says when you're donning a loista, say greater tshuva works by itself, even if it's not a tshuva gemura. Who adin when it comes to chamuras and you didn't do a tshuva gemura, if it comes to Yom Kippur, so it helps you, but it doesn't finish off the kapora. So when you're donning up the kalis, there Yom Kippur is goimer the kapora, even though you didn't do a complete tshuva. If you come and have chamuras, there you need, besides Yom Kippur, you need to have also Yisurim, because you didn't do a tshuva gemura, and Masha'en Kain, when you didn't do a tshuva gemur for Chilul Hashem, there you're going to have to wait till you misa, and that's really what the pasuk is bringing out. Now, according to this yisoid that we're explaining, that there's 2 concepts and 2 koiches in Yom Kippur. One as the power that can elevate you to do tshuva gemura, and then the klal is it could be mechaper on all chatoyim. Then there's a second degree that even if you don't reach that level, there still is a koyach in Yom Kippur in Itzum Yoim to mechaper, and that's where the Bryce is discussing. So Eibazeh, we can go back to our shilas and we can for and understand all the shilas. We had a question that Rabbeinu Yoina was asking. Rabbeinu Yoina questioned, it says in the pasuk, Mikol chatoseichem lifnei Hashem titoru. Rabbeinu Yoina asked, how is that possible when we know that on Chamuras you need Yisurim besides Yom Kippur, and it doesn't work Yom Kippur alone? And we added the same as there, Chil Hashem, it doesn't work. So how does the pasuk say Mikol Chatoseichem? And because of that, Rabbeinu Yoina said the pasuk is telling me it's a separate mitzvah on Yom Kippur. And we said in the Rambam Shita you can't say that, because the Rambam holds there is no besondere mitzvah on Yom Kippur. The fees there we can understand the pasuk, and this is what the pasuk is saying. Mikol Chatoseichem lifnei Hashem titoru is a koyach in Yom Kippur that to inspire you to get to a tshuva gemura. And if you get to that tshuva gemura, you can eradicate all your chatoyim. Mikol chatoseichem lifnei Hashem titoru. Now, lefi zeh, we are going to teach the pasuk that the pasuk itself is talking about 2 different levels and 2 different parts. The mokar that Itzum Yoim is mechaper comes from the words Ki bayoim hazeh yechaper aleichem. That's the beginning of the pasuk, and then the pasuk finishes off Mikol chatoseichem lifnei Hashem titoru. Now the beginning of the pasuk bayoim hazeh yechaper aleichem is not referring to all your chatoyim. It's talking about those chatoyim that Itzum Yoim can be mechaper. Like the Brisa says, if you have kalas loisaseh, and then you go and come to Yom Kippur, that has a power to be mechaper, because Itzum Yoim has a koyach of kapora. The Sefer Dikra is the under part of Yom Kippur, and that is the concept of Mikol Chatoseichem Lifnei Hashem Titoru. If you can get to the level of Ta'ara, which means a Tshuva Gemura, then you can get rid of all your Chatoyim just with Yom Kippur alone, and this is the Brisa and this is the Mishnah. The Mishnah, which we mentioned, that's bringing out that it could be mechaper even without anything else, that's the Chelek of Mikol Chatoseichem Lifnei Hashem Titoru. The Brisa that differentiates and says there's Dalet Chiluki Chapora, That is referring to when you don't get to a tshuva gemura, and then there's a musig that there's a koyach in Yom Kippur of Yitzum Shayim. Now, Ebazeh, we can understand very well all our tefillas of Yom Kippur, and we're going to return to our problems and our kashas that we had in the Nusach HaTefillas of Yom Kippur. We questioned that we're Messiahim all our tefillas in Yom Kippur, Umashechotasi lefanecha. Mechoik brachamecha ramim avoloi ayidei yisurim v'chaloim royim. And the question we asked was, what does it mean we're telling the Rebbeinu Shalom not to give us yisurim if we're not going to be able to get a kapora? Because the Brisa says that on the chatoim that are chamuras, it's necessary yisurim to get the kapora, and for Chil Hashem as well. So what do we mean when we say Loi al Yidei Yisurim? And the answer we're saying is because Stam Hadvorim in Yom Kippur we get to that level of Tshuva Gemura. And if we get to that level of Tshuva Gemura, it can work without Yisurim, even for Chamuras and even for Chil Hashem. So what we in essence tell the Rebbeinu Shalom is Morek b'rachamecha rabin, because Rebbeinu Shalom, I'm doing a tshuva gemura, and if I'm doing a tshuva gemura, so therefore I deserve to get a kapora without yisurim and chaloim royim. Now, lefi zeh, and also we can understand with this in our whole nusach of the al-chetz, and what we say, we talk about Chilul Hashem and we beg Hashem to give us a kapora for Chilul Hashem, even though we know that it needs Yisurim and Misa. We talk about Krisis and Misas Bezdin in our Chatoyim, and we question that. Why can we talk about Krisis and Misas Bezdin and say to the Rebbeinu Shalom Yom Kippur should be Mechaper when it can't be Mechaper without Yisurim? So what does it mean? We're saying and including all these different types of Chatoim, even the Chamors, but the answer is, but if you do a Tshuva Gemurah, you don't need Yisurim. You don't need a Misa. So we bring out that Rebbeinu Shalom, when we clap the Al-Chet, we're asking the Rebbeinu Shalom, even for those Chamuras, even for Chil Hashem, nevertheless, we're asking you to give us a complete Kaporah. Now, lefi zeh, it's going to be very beautiful, the Nusach HaTefillah that was bothering us. We say in every Tefillah, Vatitin lanu es yoyim ha-kippurim hazeh limchila l'slicha l'kapora. And then we continue and say, V'limchu boyes kol avoyneseinu. We have two questions on this nusach. Hey, how do we say limchu boyes kol avoyneseinu if it doesn't work for all our chatoim? There's chatoim that it doesn't work for. And secondly, we questioned why separate it into two parts. Why begin and say Vatitin lonus yoyim ha-kippurim hazeh limchila l'slicha l'kapora, and then we say V'limchu boy, which is in addition to what we said. We should say, you gave us Yom Kippur for Mechila, Slicha Kapor, for all our avoidness. Or but if what we're being mazrid, that there's two inyanim of Yom Kippur. One is that you can get to the Tshuva Gemurah, that it works for everything. And the second koyach of Yom Kippur is that even if I don't get to that Tshuva Gemurah, but there's a koyach of Yitzum Shel Yoim that is Mechaper, and that is not for all Chatoyim, that's only for the Kalis, like the Gemara says it, Vatitin lanu, and the Pasuk says that you gave us a Yom Kippur. That Pasuk, and that it says, Ki b'yoyim hazeh, is only referring to the Kalis, like the Gemara tells us in Yuma Daf Pevod. Eba say, this is mamish what the two things that we talk about in our davening. We begin and we say, like the beginning of the Pasuk, Vatitin lanu es yoyim ha-kippurim hazeh, limechila l'slicha l'kapora, and that is not for all our avoinus. Rather, we're saying that even if we don't do a tshuva gemurah, nevertheless, there's a koyach in Yom Kippur, that Yom Kippur could be mechaper for the kaulis, and Yom Kippur has a koyach for all those lavim, that it's mechaper, because there's a koyach in Yitzum Shel Yoim that's mechaper, even if we don't do the complete tshuva. And then we add Ulimchu boyes kol avoneseinu, bringing out the second part of Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is like we say in the pasuk, that we say that Mikol chatoseichem lifnei Hashem titoru. We bring out that if we do a tshuva gemura, then we are bekoyach to get to a complete kapora and a complete tshuva for all the chatoyim, mikol chatoseichem. So in our davening, we bring this out that there's two concepts in Yom Kippur. One, that Itzuma Shayoim is mechaper for the kalis, and two, the koyach of getting to a tshuva gemura that works on everything. Now with this we can learn up a Shvera Rambam. There's a Rambam in Perek Beis Mehilchas Tshuva Halacha Zayin. The Rambam writes, Yom HaKippurim huzman tshuva lakol la yochid ularabim. Yom Kippur is a day for tshuva for everybody. And the Rambam mentions and singles out a yochid and a rabim. And then he continues and says, Vuketz mechila utzlicha liyisrael. Now the Welt has a question on this Rambam. If the Rambam makes mention that it's a Zman Tshuva for everybody, for Yochid and Rabim, what does the Rambam mean for Rabim? Did the Rabim sin singularly? A bunch of Yechidim that sinned? If it's talking about where a Yechidim sinned and just added up to a Rabim, that's what we would call a Chet Yochid. So why talk about a Chet of Rabim? Chet Rabim obviously means that when sometimes there's the whole Rabim together jointly does Zoiver Achman Litzlan a Chet. And the Rambam is explaining to us Yom Kippur has a koyach to be mechaper for a Chet that a Yochid as an individual is choyte, and all those Yechidim that are choytim, even if it's a multitude and it's a Rabim, but for everybody who sinned, but we're all Yechidim if it's an Eigen, a private Dika sin. And then the Rambam adds, even if a Rabim sinned, nevertheless, even if a Tzibur sinned, nevertheless, Yom Kippur is mechaper. The question that's asked is, when Rabim does a sin, that's a terrible Chilul Hashem. When it comes out that you can show that the Rabim were choyte, that creates a tremendous Chilul Hashem. And if that's a tremendous Chilul Hashem, how does the Rambam say Yom Kippur is mechaper even for a Chet HaRabim? When the klal is that Yom Kippur cannot be mechaper on Chilul Hashem. We have to have, besides Yom Kippur, we have to have Yisurim and Misa. And we say Yom Kippur is a Zman Tshuva L'kol L'yochid U'L'Rabim. No, the Fizeh we can understand very well the Rambam. We explained that Yom Kippur has in it a double aspect. Besides that there's a koyach in Yom Kippur to be mechaper when you do tshuva, there's another inyan, and the other inyan is that Yom Kippur you get to the tachlis hatshuva. When you get to the tachlis hatshuva and you do a tshuva gemurah, then the halacha is that Yom Kippur could be mechaper on everything. Even chamuras, even Chilul Hashem, it has that power. So the Rambam, when he brings out Yom Kippur Uzman Tshuva Lakol, La Yochid U'Larabim, what the Rambam is bringing out is that even if there was a Rabim who was sinning, and even though there's a Chilul Hashem attached to a Chet HaRabim, Afal Pikan, and a tremendous Chilul Hashem when Rabim do something against the Ratzon Hashem, but nevertheless, that's the koyach of Yom Kippur. Because we get to a tshuva gemurah, and when the Rabim gets a tshuva gemurah, so they can get a kapora for the Chet HaRabim, because now they got to a tshuva gemurah. The Rambam talks about Rabim in the beginning of this halacha. The Rambam says, Yom HaKippurim huzman tshuva lakol la yochid u'Larabim. And then the Rambam finishes off, Vuketz mechila v'slicha, and he says L'Yisrael. And the question is, why didn't the Rambam again say Vuketz mechila u'slicha liyochid u'Larabim? Why, when it came to the end of this halacha, the Rambam didn't write it out that it works? It's a ketz mechila v'slicha liyochid u'Larabim, nor he merely says L'Yisrael. The fee, what we were explaining, this Rambam could be bringing out the two parts of Yom Kippur. And the beginning of the Rambam, when he says it works for Chet HaRabim, that's talking when you had a tshuva gemurah. As we explained, that when you have a tshuva gemurah, then the halacha is that koyach of that tshuva gemura has in it a power to be mechaper on all the chatoyim. When it's even a chet harabim. But there's another koyach of Yom Kippur, and that koyach of Yom Kippur is itzum shel yom. That even if you don't come to a tshuva gemura, nevertheless Yom Kippur is mechaper, and this is what the Rambam means to say, vuketz mechilo slicha Yisrael. The Rambam is bringing out the two parts of the pasuk. Since, like we explained, the Rambam does not hold that there is two. There's a special mitzvah on Yom Kippur, and that's not what Mikol Chatiseichen Lifnei Hashem Titor means. Mikol Chatiseichen Lifnei Hashem Titor doesn't mean like Rabbeinu Yoina, there's a separate mitzvah to do tshuva on Yom Kippur. Rather, the koyach of Yom Kippur, that Yom Kippur can be mechaper on all the chatoyim if you get to a tshuva gemurah. So now, when the Rambam finishes off V'keitz Mechila V'slicha, he's speaking about the din of Kibiyoyim, it's Itzum Sh'yoyim is Mechaper, Kibiyoyim Hazeh Yechaper Aleichem, and that's even though you didn't get to a complete tshuva. There the Rambam could not write Rabim, because if there was Rabim, then that power of Yom Kippur, of Itzum Sh'yoyim, is not going to work for that Chet Rabim, because that's Chil Hashem. And whenever there's Chilul Hashem, it's required from us to do a complete tshuva in order to get a kapora. So it turns out, what we're explaining is that there's two inyonim in Yom HaKippurim. There's one concept that Yom Kippur is a koyach that we can get to a tshuva gemura, and tomer we get to a tshuva gemura, then there's nothing that stands b'fnei a tshuva gemura. And that could work even for the most chomer dika avoynes, and it could work even for Chilul Hashem. When we're discussing a zweite madrege, where you didn't do that tshuva gemura, there's a koyach in Yom Kippur of Itzum shel yom mechaper, but that has a limitation. That is only going to work for lavim, but when it comes to chamuras, you're still going to require, Yom Kippur has a koyach for everything, even for chamuras, even if you don't come to tshuva gemura, but it's not going to eradicate the chet, and it's not going to work by itself. You're going to need to add to it Yisurim, Rachmana litzlan, and you're going to need to have Chilul Hashem. You're going to have to Rachmana litzlan, you won't get your kapor till Misa. We beg the Ribono Shel Olam in our tefillas, Ribono Shel Olam, we're being spalel that give us the koyach to get to a tshuva gemura. If we will utilize Yom Kippur to get to the tshuva gemura, we can be zoichet to the kapora gemura, and that's what we daven. And this is what we have to realize: this gvalti keschiyah that Ribono Shel Olam gave us this day of Yom Kippur. The Chinuch brings it out that we have to realize the skulas hayoim, and we have to realize the chazdei Hashem Yisborach, that He gave us such a holy day like Yom Kippur. If we utilize it properly, we can get to the greatest levels of slicha and kapora. Let us see to utilize the Yom Kippur properly. Let us see to aspire, knowing the power of Yom Kippur, knowing that we can get, if you don't know you can get to the tshuva gemura, and you don't know you can get a kapora, you don't go in with the same optimism, and with the same tshuka, and with the same elevation, and the same begging for the Ribono Shel Olam. Let us take our zman and utilize it to prepare ourselves for this heilige day of Yom Kippur, that we should become like Malochim, to get ourselves rid of all our chatoyim. The way we can do it is if we get to the complete level of tshuva, machmas the tshuva of the koyach of the yoim, we have the heinuyim, we remove ourselves from anything that has a shaychus to chet. It says in the Psik that Ribono Shel Olam is made on Klal Yisrael. Malachi Ashoris are made on Klal Yisrael. That we are like Malochim. We can get there. Let us see to get to that level of tshuva, to get to the tshuva gemura once and for all, that we should be zoichet to get a complete kapora. But if you don't get to the kapora hakloli, to get to the complete kapora, realize the power of Yom Kippur, because Yom Kippur has a double aspect to it. Ki bayoyim hazeh yichaper aleichem l'tayer eschem mikol chatiseichem lifnei Hashem titoru.